I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and today, together, we're going to test the new MG HS. Now, I've been looking forward to driving this car because the previous MG HS was, in my estimation, one of the worst midsize SUVs to drive. To put a positive spin on it, that means that it had the biggest room for improvement. And before we get into anything else in today's video, I am pleased to report that this car is much improved. Has it gone to the top of the class? No, it hasn't, but it didn't need to, because even though the new HS is a brand new car underneath the skin, improved in virtually every way, including inside and to drive, it's still one of the more affordable midsize SUVs on the market, particularly with its current promotional national driveaway pricing. I've got one here with all the fruit. This is the Essence trim, the top of the 3-strong HS lineup, and it's just over $40,000 drive away, which in 2024 is reasonably affordable for a car like this. So in today's video, we're going to do our usual thing. We'll check out the interior of the new HS, the back seat and the boot. We'll discuss the running costs of this midsize SUV, and then crucially, we'll go for a drive and see what this vehicle is like dynamically, and that is the area where the HS really needed to improve the most, and we'll explain how that's gone before I come to a verdict and let you know whether you should be test driving or buying this vehicle. But before we get started, hit subscribe down below. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Budget Direct. Jumping into the new MG HS now, the first thing to know about this MG is that it is not really an MG. What do I mean by that? Well, over in China, this vehicle doesn't actually wear MG branding. This car is actually a product of the Chinese brand Refinement, which is one of the brands that MG created when it bought the British brand Rover back in the day. Now, Refinement is more of a premium brand of the MG stable over in China. So that means that it's not surprising that the new HS looks like a more premium product than the rather dowdy old model that it replaced. And that's both outside and inside, where this car looks and feels more expensive than it did before. And frankly, I'm actually quite a fan of the appearance. It's nothing crazy or nothing special. It just looks subtle and well resolved, which is a nice improvement for the car. Now, over in China, the Refinement RX-5, which is what the HS is called, has an expansive range, including a hybrid and a plug-in hybrid, which are both on the menu for Australia. But for now, there's 3 varieties of the new HS, all sharing the same turbocharged petrol engine, which we'll talk about later. From the base model, this car is still really affordable and can be had for less than 35 grand drive away, which in this day and age is great. That car is still decently equipped and has cloth seats, which I actually like, whereas the higher trims start moving up to pleather all around the cabin, including this Essence. But even the very top specification HS is still very affordable compared to rivals, and certainly inside, it doesn't skimp too much on specification, with a couple of catches. First of all, we sit on seats that are comfortable enough. They're certainly not the last word in ergonomics, and one problem is that there still isn't thigh angle or seat tilt adjustment, which if you've got longer legs can leave you feeling a bit strange in positioning your legs down in the pedal box. But we have picked up 4-way lumbar now, which really helps in terms of back support. There's also memory seat and mirrors for the driver, which is nice to have. And the steering wheel, which is adjustable for rake and reach, actually does sit in a good position. And it's quite an attractive design with perforations and physical shortcut keys, including a couple of programmable ones, which will become important when we take this car for a drive. So watch this space. Looking through the wheel, we have a pair of 12.3-inch screens in a sort of one-piece design that's a little bit reminiscent of BMW or perhaps a Hyundai, but it looks really premium and good. The central screen is easy enough to use with MG's system, but it does bury things like fan speed and temperature in the screen, as so many cars do now, and that's a bit of a faff to adjust on the move. Driver's display has some level of customization to it, definitely could be a little bit more intuitive to use, but you've got all the basics, including a trip computer and the ability to put a map on there too. However, in a strange miss, which we're not usually seeing anymore at all in any car we test, The new HS doesn't have wireless Apple CarPlay or wireless Android Auto. You've got to plug it in with a cable. Well, big deal, I hear you saying. Well, it kind of is, because even though this is a brand new car, the cable that you'll require is an old school USB-A cable. And given the world started moving to USB-C 5 or 6 years ago, I don't actually have a USB-A cable close to hand anymore for my phone. Of course, you might, but why are we moving backwards with a brand new car in 2024? That is weird in my books. In terms of the material quality, as I say, it is full of pleather, which definitely gives it a veneer of premiumness. You can go looking for some harder surfaces if you want to find them. And on the whole, there is a sense that it looks premium, but it is kind of cobbled together from some slightly down market plastics and a lot of piano black, which is already scratched down here around the gear selector, even though this car's only got a few miles on it. That being said, it's definitely nice enough, and as a dog's body vehicle that's just going to ferry the kids around, this is more than enough. One thing I will say is that with the Essence, you can actually sub out the black interior for a pretty nice tan interior with some exterior colors, including this gray, and that's exactly what I would do. Makes the cabin even lighter underneath the Essence's opening panoramic roof. So that's the front seat. Decent enough for the money. Let's check out the back. You'll remember from up front, I mentioned that this is actually an altogether different car to the old MG HS. Different platform, different model, and as a result, every dimension of the new HS is bigger other than height. It's a little bit lower, which is one of the things that makes it look better outside, but it's longer, it's wider, and the wheelbase is longer too. And a longer wheelbase is where you get your interior space from, at least for the front seat and the back seat. And that's exactly what we get here. Driver's seat's in my position. I'm 6 foot or 183 centimeters tall, and you can see I've got voluminous legroom sitting behind myself. But MG hasn't actually stopped there in making the back seat a nice livable space. Unlike so many cars I test, the under thigh angle of the back seat has actually been set properly in the HS to support the legs of rear seat passengers. So well done on catching that detail, MG. I could do a few hours back here with no issue because the legroom's good, my legs are supported, headroom's fine for me, and toe room is capacious underneath the driver's seat as well. You could use the center seat if you wanted, probably for someone a bit smaller, but as a car for 4 adults or 2 parents and teenagers, this is absolutely doable. And then here in the center, we've got a flip down armrest featuring even more double stitching. These sort of more expensive elements starting to come through into the MGs. 2 cup holders there. We do have air vents in the back and even soft touch materials, which is not something you'd find on, say, a Volkswagen Tiguan in the second row. So you see what I mean, that this car has various touches from one of MG's more premium brands overseas, which is nice to see here in Australia. Not to mention things like grab handles for all 4 passengers, LED reading lights. It's all pretty nicely executed. So as far as back seats go in the midsize SUV segment, this is actually one of the best ones. Moving around the back of the HS now, I would say that while styling is always subjective, I think the looks of this vehicle are much improved. Now, it is based on an altogether different model in China than what we see here in Australia. In a way, this is actually a product from MG's higher end brand over in China. And that translates through to the looks, which I would say are more premium. You have that long nose up front, the 19-inch wheels of the Essence look good. And then around back, I like the subtle resolved styling, and the full width light bar also looks pretty special on this vehicle. We do have a power tailgate, beeps on its way up, but that gets out of the way to reveal a good versatile boot of over 500 litres in capacity. The load height isn't too bad, it's nice and square, reasonably wide aperture, and you've got a cargo blind here with a sort of mock leather finish. However, that cargo blind is one of the hardest that I've ever seen to reinstall once you've taken it out. So if this was my car, it'd be staying in. That of course makes it a little bit annoying to load bikes and stuff because your cargo blind is a real nasty thing in order to reinstall. But you do have 60/40 flat folding rear seats, which is good. And then beneath the boot floor here, we've got some tools. And then beneath that, we have a space saver spare on all varieties of the HS. Now, that's not as good as a full-size spare, of course, but any spare is becoming quite rare in even this category now. Button up here to close the power tailgate. a symphony of beeps. That closes up, and that means that we can now discuss the running costs of the vehicle.
Ownership costs are reasonable for the MG-HS, starting with acceptable fuel consumption on our comprehensive test of 7.6 litres per 100 kilometres against MG's claims of 5.8 litres highway and 8.9 litres city. But keep in mind the HS requires premium petrol at the Bowser. Expect consumption to be slashed by the arrival of full hybrid and plug-in hybrid versions of the HS later on. Logbook servicing for the MG HS is done every 12 months or 15,000 kilometres. Service pricing is a little expensive, averaging $470 per year for the first 5 years, considerably more than maintaining a Toyota RAV4. But of course, the MG is much cheaper to buy. Each MG service does activate another year of roadside assistance out to 10 years maximum. Special praise should be reserved for the warranty at 10 years or 250,000 kilometres, though for commercial and roadshare drivers, it's a 7-year warranty with a more limiting 160,000 kilometres.
Okay, so let's take the new MG HS for a drive, a process which for me starts with some pre-flight checks. So I have mapped one of these steering wheel stars to the vehicle menu in the touchscreen, MG Pilot, turn off the overspeed audible warning, turn off the lane departure assist, and turn off the driver distraction monitoring. Indicate and we'll pull out. Now, it's not because any of those technologies are inherently bad or that I'm against them. It's the way they're tuned in the MG, which is far too sensitive or just downright inaccurate. So audible speed monitoring, that's a European law, which probably shouldn't be inflicted on Australian drivers given it's not law in this country, but that's what the MG and plenty of other cars like recent Hyundais and Kias have done to us here in Australia. Now the issue is that the HS doesn't get the speed right all the time. Case in point, I pull out of the Chasing Cars office, which has those 5 km/h speed limit signs in the car park, just the ones you buy down at Bunnings. However, you pull out onto a road which has an 80 km/h speed limit, but the car still thinks that it's either 5 or 40 in my experience, not 80. So you're driving down this road at 80 km/h and the car is binging and bonging desperately at you to slow down. So that's very annoying, hence why I turn it off. Then there's the driver distraction monitoring fed by this camera that looks at you up here. Again, being distracted while driving is a bad thing, but just glancing down at your speedometer or something over here on your Apple CarPlay for a second is enough to make the car start abusing you for being distracted, when we all know that's not what driver distraction is really meant to be. So it's too sensitive, and the lane keeping assist is doing a valiant job of trying to keep the car in the center of the lane, which isn't a bad thing, but the system hasn't been tuned with the nuance to know when you might want to move the car slightly in the lane, such as avoiding a cyclist, moving away slightly from a truck in the lane next to you, or even just on a country road like the one I test cars on here, where you might want to take a little bit more of a sporty line in your lane. Well, the whole time the HS is trying to tug the steering wheel away from you, and again, that just gets really fatiguing and annoying, so I turn it off. But I want to talk about the tuning of these safety features first, because this is an area that MG needs to improve on the most. It's not just MG, there's quite a lot of other Chinese brands where the software tuning is what is lagging behind some of their more conventional rivals. And you can tell there's work going into it to improve it, but more needs to be done there. But frankly, the list of outright severe negatives about the HS is now quite short. There are other things this car doesn't do perfectly, and I'll come to those, but the improvements between the previous generation and the new HS are so significant that it really is praiseworthy because this car still isn't that expensive. I want to start with one of the things that's been improved the most, and that's the powertrain in this vehicle. So we've got a 1.5 litre turbocharged petrol 4-cylinder engine. The old HS was also a turbo 4. But the marriage between the engine and the transmission in the HS is so improved now that the whole thing is actually just very drivable. It's not fast, but it's a reasonably refined package. We've got 125 kilowatts of power and 275 newton meters of torque. So, that's pretty comparable with something like a base to mid-level Tiguan, which is definitely good. And the dual clutch automatic, which has 7 speeds, is now a wet clutch setup. So there used to be a dry clutch DCT, which was pretty awful in the old car. We now have a wet clutch unit, which is much better. It takes up the clutch really well as you pull off from the line. It just drives pretty seamlessly, which is what you want from a vehicle with an automatic transmission. Now, DCTs historically have been touch and go with reliability. The 10-year warranty on this car definitely gives you a bit of peace of mind in that department. Another thing which is radically improved from the old HS is the steering. Is this a sports car? No, but the steering now has really intuitive weighting and a good ratio through it, and it just feels natural and well connected to the front wheels and to the road when you're steering the car. It used to feel really disconnected and weird, so that has just been solved as far as I'm concerned. I like the way the HS steers. Other improvements include the body control, the ride, and the refinement. But those improvements aren't quite to the same level as the powertrain, the transmission, and the steering. Take the ride quality. We are running on 19-inch wheels here, which is relatively big, but the sidewall is still quite generous on the HS, even with 19s. A problem is the suspension tuning isn't quite there on the new HS. It is definitely an improvement on the old car. But the problem that we now have is a bit of a disconnect between the tuning of the suspension on the front and on the back. Put simply, the front feels a little bit firmer than the rear, and that just generates some unusual effects when you're driving, which is you traverse a bump and you feel a bit of firmness, not an unacceptable amount of firmness, but then you get some float from the rear. It reminds me a little bit of the Mazda CX-60, although not as bad. The MG is actually better than the early suspension tune of those Mazda SUVs. But it just means that you get some slightly inconsistent responses from the car as you're driving down a more difficult, bumpy, pockmarked country road like this one. The front actually, which has a bit more firmness, it traverses a bump, you feel it, but then it settles quickly, whereas the rear just doesn't feel as tied down. And so as a result, you end up slowing down a little bit and just traveling at a graceful pace, which I think is what most people will do in a mid-sized family SUV anyway. But you jump into something like a Mazda CX-5 or a Kia Sportage or a Volkswagen Tiguan, and you just know that there's a more cohesive, coherent suspension tune in those cars, which is ultimately more comfortable to ride in, but also has a higher threshold, so you can actually drive it a little bit quicker on a curving road if you want to. The HS doesn't aspire to any of that stuff. It's not bad, but certainly you feel the body control isn't perfect. There's a little bit of fidget, a little bit of float, which I think MG could dial out. In fact, I know they could, because the MG4 has all of those things sorted. The MG4 has a fantastic ride quality and fantastic body control. I'd love to see the people that did that apply those same talents to the HS, because it probably would be one of the best cars in the class if they bothered to do that. Instead, the final suspension tune here is fine, it's acceptable, but nothing special. On the refinement front, well, have a listen. Doesn't sound too bad, but the engine is definitely audible. You hear it working away in the background. It's fairly gruff, fairly coarse, not like a diesel, but getting to be along those lines. Something like a Tiguan is quieter in the engine department for sure. Brake pedal feel, don't love that. That's definitely something that could have been improved. It's pretty squidgy under the foot. It's not too wooden, it's just there's a lot of free travel in the pedal before the brakes start doing anything, which isn't particularly confidence inspiring. Of course you do get used to it. Visibility is really great. Fantastic view forward over the bonnet. Huge mirrors, which look kind of funny, but ultimately they give you a lot of rearward visibility, which is fantastic. We've got a nice frameless rear view mirror here and a fairly conventional rear end, so you can actually see out of this SUV, which is great. And a 360-degree camera on this grade 2, which definitely helps with parking the thing. Road noise, reasonably pronounced in this car, I would say. Pretty big tires. MG has talked up the extra sound insulation in the HS, and it probably is a bit quieter than the old one, but it's not a quiet vehicle by any stretch. Definitely you can hear the rumble off this poorly surfaced road that I'm testing the car on now. One thing I will say though is they've actually insulated the suspension noise pretty well, and this thing does have a proper multi-link independent rear suspension. So not a torsion beam, even though this car's only front wheel drive. They might have cheaped out, but they didn't, which is great. And there's no boom or suspension noise coming through into the cabin, which is fantastic. Now, what's coming? A hybrid and a plug-in hybrid. Two interesting combinations. Both of them are much faster than the turbo petrol as a standalone engine, so they should be interesting. The plug-in hybrid will give MG another direct rival to the likes of the BYD C-Line 6, which is great, and would also be eligible for the FBT waiver for leasing customers, at least for purchases until the middle of 2025 at this point. The hybrid might be a best of both worlds proposition, which should keep the cost down compared to the plug-in, but also deliver significantly better fuel economy, which, let's face it, wasn't great in the turbo petrol. So what's my verdict on the new MG HS in Essence trim? Well, frankly, I think MG has done enough to improve this vehicle to where it should be. What MG hasn't done is price this vehicle like a CX-5, Tiguan, Tucson Sportage. It is still demonstrably cheaper than those cars, so it doesn't actually have to be as good as them. And it isn't. But it is a radical improvement on the previous generation HS, which was woeful dynamically, and its interior needed a few improvements too. The HS, I would say, is now average for the class, but it doesn't have an average price tag. At just over $40,000 drive away in Essence trim, you are getting a lot of toys for the money, and you're also getting driving dynamics which are just about acceptable, though certainly not exceptional. What I would love to see in future is MG put its top boffins who developed the MG4, the superb small electric car from this brand, onto a product like the HS. The MG4 is so well executed and so good to drive that it makes me think MG could probably have something near the top of the class in the midsize SUV segment if it wanted to. But clearly at this point, it actually doesn't yet want that. MG just wants to be acceptable, and the sales numbers clearly show that that's a formula that works for Australians. So from my perspective as an expert road tester, I'm actually satisfied that this vehicle has been improved from poor to average because the prices still reflect that that is fair for this car. Over to you though, I'm keen to know what you think of the new HS, so please let me know down below in the comments. While you're there, hit subscribe and the notification bell if you've enjoyed this video and want to see more independent road tests from Chasing Cars. And as always, thank you for watching.